Hello, I'm Llewellyn King, the host of White House Chronicle. Thank you for coming along. Today we're going to take a look at Germany, its role in Europe today, its possible future role. This Germany, the great, massive industrial force in the European Union, is going through a trying time and is changing. To explain the whole German situation to us, we have Jackson James, Senior Fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Jack, welcome to the broadcast.
Nice to be here.
Well, what's happening in Germany? We've had a visit to Washington recently of the new chancellor, or the relatively new chancellor, Olaf Scholz. And are there big changes? We know that Germany has been very vulnerable to Russian gas. We know that Germany nonetheless has stood with the Ukraine, showing a determination that not everybody thought it would. What's going on?
In a way, it's kind of like a bit of a political catharsis. The definite shock of what happened last year on February 24th has called into question a number of assumptions, maybe a narrative or two that Germany had been holding as far as its relationship with Russia, and just also the general sense of what is one supposed to do as the major central country in Europe to stop this type of warfare going on in Ukraine, and what are its responsibilities. And I think that this is also something that harks back to almost the beginning of the time when Germany was reunified in 1990. If you might recall, Llewellyn, there was a speech that George Herbert Walker Bush gave in Mainz just before the wall came down. And in it, he requested that Germany and the United States be partners in leadership. And I think that at this point, Germany is struggling with that equation. What does it mean to be a leader in partnership with not only its European partners, but its transatlantic partners in dealing with the worst outbreak of war since 1945? And it's a very big catharsis for the Germans to understand what the consequences are for the country. And that's what Scholz has inherited as he took office in December of 2021.
I think we should tell our viewers, or you should tell our viewers, Jack, about your long relationship with Germany and how you come to have the depth of understanding and expertise which you do have.
It's a half century of commuting across the Atlantic. I began that process in a very interesting, also cathartic year in 1968, when Germany was going through a bit of a challenge in its own right at that point, West Germany, trying to deal with a generational clash, but also its history. And since then, I've lived and worked in Germany in various different capacities for more than 15 years. I've been married to a German for 43 years. Both of my children are double citizens. And so it's been a very, very personal and professional relationship that's very deep, very long. And it's been a very, very interesting journey the whole time. And I'm not done yet.
How do you see Germany today as opposed to 50 years ago?
But I think that at that point, Germany, as I like to say with regard to its understanding of itself, was an object of the Cold War. It was the front of the Cold War. It was right there in the Brandenburg Gate, embodied in it. And for those 40 years of the Cold War, plus after World War II, Germany was the turf over which the Cold War was fought. And I think that in that context, you could say that Germany felt it was the object of, in this case, American foreign policy, but certainly in general. But when 1990 came along, Germany, I like to say, became the subject of not only American foreign policy, but European foreign policy, because it was now the largest economy. It was going to be the key state, central in Europe. And there were great expectations attached to it, from outside Germany as perhaps within it. And that's been the kind of growing pains over these last 30 years that Germany's had to cope with. What are its expectations as an economic force of the greatest sort in Europe? What are its responsibilities as a protector of the Europe in which it has embedded itself for so many years? And how does it then implement that responsibility? And the Ukraine war has brought that into extreme focus. And that's where Germany is today.
In the US, we look at Germany and we think of it as having the finest engineering, remarkably good labor relations, which don't always go with the manufacturing base, and it being a country that works well on many levels, but which somehow allowed itself to move more into the Russian orbit than probably was wise for it.
I think after the war was over, there was an effort to put together a sense of how Germany was going to do two things. It was embodied in a phrase that was often used by many people, and it was basically this: never again, of course, with a view toward World War II and the Holocaust, but never alone. And I think that that was the real concentration of the Federal Republic as West Germany for the many years that before unification, to embed itself with Europe. Now, in doing that, it became a marvelously impressive economy in a very short time, by the way, with a great deal of help from the German, from the Marshall Fund, that Marshall Plan, after which my organization is named. But it was also capable of putting together something that I think is particularly German, if you want to go in that direction, Llewellyn. The social market economy was a key to its development after World War II. And I think that that notion of being able to be social, strong market, but with a context that basically allowed German citizens to see a future again. That was what Konrad Adenauer, as the first chancellor, tried to produce and promote. And when you think about it, what makes Germany Germany as well is the fact that it's been so stable over these years, including this catharsis of unification, which was totally, in my view, unexpected, even until the last couple of years before it happened. One little fact is interesting perhaps to consider. There have been 9 chancellors of the Federal Republic of Germany, both before and after the unification. And when you compare that with the kind of the convulsions that go on in other countries, for example, Italy, it's been very steady and very stable over these many years. And Germans, in that respect, are very focused on that. They like to have the stability and the security of, after having a relatively tumultuous history, going way back, if you will, they like to sense that there is a security around them. And that was the way it was in the Cold War, but it was more so after 1990 that the Germans felt, suddenly we are now surrounded for the very first time in our history only by friends.
Germany is fairly unique in the number of immigrants it has brought in voluntarily. How is it dealing with? Why is it more comfortable with its immigrants than some European countries, particularly?
Well, it wasn't always that way. I mean, the notion of the immigration that you mentioned earlier about the Turks and the Italians, a great group of them coming in at the invitation of the German Federal Republic in those years of the 60s and the 70s, it was basically because they had lost so much labor power during the war. They had to have it replaced. So these individuals from Turkey and from Italy and others in Yugoslavia at the time were invited to come in and fill that gap. It became a relatively controversial issue, however, in the 70s, because at some point or another, what was originally thought about these people being guest workers, coming in and working for a while, making some money, and then going back to their homes, didn't happen. People began to settle in where they had left, where they had found a home in Germany. And that raised the whole question about what is German, how much diversity could Germany, or does Germany want to tolerate and to have in its society? if I can basically flash forward for a minute, when I watched television in Germany in the 70s, you would never see a person of color on any news program or in any way, shape, or form in a public domain as much as you do now. And I think that this notion of the multicultural nature of Germany has been at the one time far more accepted in these last few decades, but it has not come without tensions. And we saw that after German unification in 1990, not only in East Germany, but elsewhere. And so it's a constant, interesting evolution of a country that Germany's always been part of other cultures. There were Poles that came into Germany in great numbers after the turn of the century in 1905. There were many people that came after the war, 12 million, who came back in from various parts of Eastern Europe and settled in then Germany, Western Germany. So it's not like it's not a country of immigration, but it was a mental change and a mental challenge for them to absorb people who were not from Europe. And that's when you get back to the question of 2015, when Merkel opened the gates to a number of people, a large number of people, 1 million people. But that has happened. I think it's been well taken care of. I don't say that there aren't tensions anymore, but they manage that.
One of the things that has surprised people was how vociferous, aggressive, and effective the Green Party was in Germany, which one didn't somehow expect from an industrial giant.
The Greens were born in the late 70s as a party, and they basically took on two tasks. One was standing up for the environment, and the other one was standing up for the notion of humanitarian policies. In that 20-year period between the time that they entered into state government and then eventually into the Bundestag, they evolved ever more in the direction of trying to figure out what standing up for humanitarian values meant. And in that context, one of the major milestones for the Greens was in 1999, during the Kosovo conflict, when Joschka Fischer, who at that point was the first Green foreign minister, and the Greens in the first coalition government with the Social Democrats, were dealing with the fact that they were being asked to participate in a shooting war in the Balkans. And Joschka Fischer, as the head of the Green Party, basically said, yes, we want to say no more war, friends, but we also want to say no more Auschwitz.
Tell us about the Chancellor. Tell us about the current government and Olaf Scholz.
Olaf Scholz was a politician going back almost to his teens. He became a part of the Social Democratic Party in the younger groups in the late 70s, early 80s. And then he became very active in politics in his home city of Hamburg. And in the process of the last 8 years or so, he had been then, because of the coalition between Merkel's CDU and the SPD, became part of the cabinet. And I think that basically he is a person who in many ways is very similar to Merkel herself. He served with her, obviously, but when he took over as chancellor, he was somewhat similar in her style. One could say they're different in different ways, but in one way they were similar. It was a cool, calm, collected approach to politics that he wanted to take, particularly at the beginning, before the war broke out in February of 2022. But he's a very, very polished, I wouldn't say in a negative way, bureaucrat who knew how to run the city of Hamburg and then became the vice chancellor. So he's a polished politician, not very charismatic. He doesn't really inspire people with great speeches, but he's in sync, I think, very much like Merkel was with her public for those 16 years she was chancellor.
For the benefit of our listeners on Sirius XM Radio's POTUS, Channel 124, you are listening to White House Chronicle. I am Llewellyn King, executive producer and host. My guest today is Jackson James, senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. White House Chronicle airs nationwide on PBS, public educational and government access channels, and worldwide on Voice of America television and radio in English and translated into Chinese. It is now available as a podcast on Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, or your favorite audio platform. You can watch this and previous episodes of White House Chronicle on our website, whchronicle.com. If you would like to receive my weekly columns by email, just send me a note at llewellynking1@gmail.com. And Llewellyn, please remember, has 4 L's. How did Germany come to be so dependent on Russian hydrocarbons, and particularly natural gas?
Well, I think basically there were 2 or 3 things working at the same time, Llewellyn. One of them was the fact that it was a cheap supply of gas. And, you know, the industries that Germany had are very gas producing. In other words, hungry for gas. The second thing I think is that in the context of 1971, when Willy Brandt became chancellor, he became chancellor in 1969, but in that period of time that he was chancellor, he really worked hard at overcoming the past and the war by building bridges to Moscow. That, of course, was designed to eventually get to perhaps a closer relationship with the GDR, East Germany, and eventually, you could say, it led to unification. So those reaching out to Russia, economically speaking, was also an attempt to overcome historical conflicts, and particularly the remnants of World War II. And the third thing was, I think that there was a great deal of feeling, and that was the nature of this concept that Willy Brandt basically put a big stamp on, which was called Ostpolitik. And Ostpolitik was designed on the premise that if you involve people in an economic, ever-expanding network of interdependence, that there will be an avoidance of war. And that was something I think that propelled the relationship with Moscow. Thinking particularly after 1990, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, quo vadis Russia. And it was an effort on their part to come to grips with the fact that maybe they could pull Russia into a European network, which would then diminish any problems in the future. Well, that didn't work out very well.
What is the effect of Germany in the rest of the European community? From time to time, it comes in for criticism. For example, when the Greeks had their terrible debt crisis, Germany was criticized for being too slow to help and having conditions that were very onerous. And everybody was quite mad at Germany for not being more generous and opening their wallets to the Greeks. And there is some resentment, I think, in other things, other rather strange actions taken by Germany, like the sudden closing of its nuclear power plants, changing basically the shape of the European electric grid. What about those things? How does it sit in Europe? Is it regarded? Is it a happy relationship? Is there normal resentment to the rich boy on the block? How is it?
I think so. There is resentment. And you talked about the way the Euro crisis was handled back then, 10 years ago. Germany came across as very arrogant in the sense of saying, you know, you got to clean up your own act to make sure that you are capable of making use of this shared income that we are being asked to give you. I think that Germany's sense has always been kind of a little bit schizophrenic. On the one hand, we want to be part of Europe and we don't want to lead and get out in front because the shadows of the past will once again become visible on the walls. And at the same time, they're quite capable of putting their own interests ahead in dealing with other parts of Europe. So often they'll say we don't want to have what they call in German ein Alleingang, a sole, their own way of doing things, but they do, and like any other country in Europe. So I think Merkel put it one way the other year or two, the last year I think she was in office. She said, we're becoming a little bit like America in Europe. In other words, resentful about the big bloc, the big boy on the block, as you just indicated, as America has always been resented a bit in Europe, and not only in other countries, not only in Germany, but elsewhere, particularly in France. But I think that to some extent, I always used to say, get used to that, because you are a very important and big player on the block. You're going to have to take the critique with the cooperation.
That sort of thing has been rather endorsed by Britain's withdrawal from the European Union. Suddenly, Germany really is. It's Germany and France and the others. How is that relationship with the French?
That's tough at the moment because you've got very difficult situation in terms of trying to agree on things. Just simply, you just mentioned it before. The fact that a river running through those two, at the border between those two states, divides two countries, one of which has 80% of its electricity from nuclear power, and the other one shutting down its nuclear plants one by one until last year. I think it's it's a relationship that's also fraught with history. And of course, that has always been talked about as the motor of Europe, the motor of European integration and unity. At the moment, I would tell you it's very, very fraught with tension. You have a somewhat weak president in France who was elected, but barely, and doesn't have a complete unified government under his control. And they're finding themselves a little bit at odds on trying to figure out what their relationships is with the United States. There's a big debate between France and Germany about this concept. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but strategic sovereignty, and the notion that the Europeans should be able to have their own forces and their own capacity to defend themselves. And why shouldn't that be led by a country which is the only nuclear power now in the European Union,
which is France.
Right. And so there's some tension, some competition, style differences specifically between, as I tried to describe Scholz before, it's very different personality with Mr. Macron. So a lot of people are worried about this relationship, a little bit in a fraught state.
Are we going to see a more defense-conscious Germany? Is it going to up its armed forces? Is it going to begin to look like many other European countries with a proportion of its income devoted to the military?
You know, it used to be when I was living in Germany in the 70s and the early 80s that there was a largest army in Europe, and Germany was the one that held off the tanks on the other side of the wall with its vast Bundeswehr. That was basically just rethought after 1990 as no longer being necessary. The Bundeswehr at the moment is in bad shape. It's not the only army in Europe that's in bad shape, let me point out. But the army is down by a substantial number of soldiers, and it had been basically in a very financially weakened position during these last 30 years. So to rebuild this is going to take time. Now, you've heard the concept of Zeitenwende, the kind of speech that Mr. Scholz gave in February of last year, where he said, we're going to now come back with 100 billion euros and we're going to rebuild the army. You don't do that overnight. And you don't do it with a wave of the magic wand, even with $100 billion in that wand. So I think to say that Germany is going to carry its weight militarily is going to require two things. It's going to require time, and it's going to require a mental shift within the country, who is going to have to be carried by the public to see whether or not the capacity of Germany, not only within the European Union, but within the Transatlantic Alliance, the NATO alliance, to carry more of a burden and carry more responsibility and capacity, which is capable of doing and should be. but it's not going to be overnight.
I'd like in our last minute or so together to know more about the German Marshall Fund of the US, an intriguing name to begin with.
Yes, it's a very interesting story, if I might say it this way. In 1968, there was a thought given to a gesture on the part of the German government to say thank you for the Marshall Plan. That was a thought generated by a friend of mine who's unfortunately deceased. His name was Guido Goldman, a very important gentleman at Harvard. But his father, Natum Goldman, had been one of the key negotiators with Adenauer over reparations with Israel. Guido had a terrific amount of entree in Germany, and so he made the suggestion that there should be perhaps a recognition of the Marshall Plan, something that would maybe be a grant, a chair at a university, maybe Harvard. Well, the Minister of Finance, Alex Miller was his name, and he decided, no, we want to do more than this. And he decided that they should create a foundation. And that foundation would be called after the German Marshall Fund, would be named after it. The German Marshall Fund of the United States, an American organization, but based on the principle that the Marshall Fund had created this bond between Germany and the United States. And so the location of the foundation would be in Washington. So subsequent to its creation in 1972, by a vast grant from the German government, the Marshall Fund has grown over the last 50 years into one of the more important transatlantic bridge building institutions in the United States. And it has been at very multiple levels active in doing just that. It isn't about only strategic issues like Ukraine. There's a great deal of work done on what do cities have in common? What do regions in the United States and Germany and in Europe have in common? And even beyond that, there's a great deal of focus on the Marshall Plan's legacy for all of Europe. Not everybody in Europe in 1947 could take advantage of the Marshall Plan in Europe. But now, whether Europe that's whole and free, so to speak, that's another remembrance of how important the Marshall Plan was at the time. So it's a historical recognition of something that made it possible to rebuild Europe after a disastrous war, and is still 50 years later working on making sure that those bonds stay intact.
Well, that's absolutely fascinating. Jackson, would you tell us in the last seconds, for a visitor going for the first time to Germany, where should they go?
Berlin. It is a city that represents all of which has happened so much in the last not only 30 years since unification, but is a city of memory, a city of history, a city which tells a great story about remembering and renewing. And that's what Berlin represents.
That's our show for today. We shall remember Berlin, and I'm glad to say that I have been there until next week. That's our show. Thank you for coming along, and you can go and do something very German like hiking. Cheers.